These days, peaceful protest in our nation's capital against our corrupt ruling class is liable to get a man arrested. So I figured, if I'm going to get arrested for what I say on this campus tour, I might as well get it over with at the first stop so that I can save myself the trouble of writing all of those additional speeches. I don't think that I will be arrested for my speech here tonight, but it is a distinct possibility. It's been happening a lot recently, and I'm not even talking about the January 6th people. I'm sorry, excuse me. The January 6th, the very worst day in the history of this or any republic, the day our sacred democracy nearly collapsed. I'm not talking about that, but I do want to be precise, lest I share the fate of that amiable horn hat guy and all of the Midwestern grannies who are rotting away in solitary for the high crime of taking a selfie in the Capitol Rotunda. I don't want to end up there. When I talk about the possibility of being arrested in Washington, D.C. for peaceful protest, I'm not referring to the January 6th people. It is true many of those people did nothing violent and were even escorted into the Capitol by Capitol Hill police. It is true that even the very worst acts that took place on January 6th paled in comparison to the half-dozen other mostly leftist attacks that have taken place at the Capitol that our establishment media have memory hold. I'm thinking, of course, of attacks such as the 1915 bombing of the Senate reception room by a Harvard professor. Of course, it was a Harvard professor. I'm thinking of the shooting by Puerto Rican radicals that left 5 congressmen injured in 1954, radicals who were later granted clemency by Jimmy Carter, of course. I'm thinking of attacks such as the 1971 bombing of the Capitol by the far-left Weather Underground, whose co-founder Bill Ayers was a mentor to Barack Obama, or the 1983 bombing of the Capitol by the Radical Armed Resistance Unit in protest of President Reagan's policy in Grenada and Lebanon, and some other attacks too. All of those were obviously orders of magnitude more serious and criminal than anything carried out by the January 6th demonstrators, who were apparently so inept at insurrection that not one of them remembered to bring any weapons, which is good. When I talk about the possibility of being arrested in Washington, D.C. for peaceful protest, I'm not talking about the January 6thers, some of whom at least were unruly. I am talking about the 8 pro-life advocates who are currently in jail and facing 11 years behind bars for peacefully protesting at an infanticide mill, the operators of which were proven to have regularly violated federal law, conducted illegal abortions, deprived babies born alive of federally mandated medical care, and hidden their crimes by improperly disposing of the babies' bodies. The abortionist in charge admitted to these sorts of crimes on camera. 8 pro-life advocates peacefully demonstrated against the clinic: Lauren Handy, John Hinshaw, Heather Idoni, William Goodman, Herb Garrity, Joan Bell, Jonathan Darnell, and Gene Marshall. These pro-life advocates, unlike the infanticidal butcher that they were protesting, Cesare Santangelo, have never killed anyone. They would never hurt a fly, and yet they are currently sitting in jail. Some of them are quite young. Herb Garrity is 25 years old. Some of them are a bit older. Joan Bell is 74. She is the mother of 7. She and her husband Chris have raised 1 biological child and 6 adopted children, all adopted with disabilities, and 1 saved from abortion by the Bells' heroic decision to adopt that child. Joan is the kind of menace to society that our rulers are presently locking up for more than a decade, which at the age of 74 could well mean death in a prison cell. Our president, Joe Biden, is right down the street. He could easily pardon Joan and the rest of the pro-life advocates this very minute. Joe Biden is Catholic, at least nominally. Joe Biden, in particular, has a moral responsibility to free Joan and the rest of the pro-life political prisoners. At the very least, he could commute their sentences. But he won't do that. Of course he won't. It was his jackbooted thugs who arrested them in the first place. There were crimes taking place at Cesare Santangelo's abortion clinic. There still are. But when the police showed up, they didn't arrest the criminals. They arrested the pro-life advocates peaceably bringing attention to the criminals' crimes. And this wasn't just some mix-up, some miscommunication between the chief executive and his law enforcement officers. If it were, Biden would have intervened. But he won't, because prison is precisely where he wants these pro-lifers. It's evil. Imprisoning people for peaceably demonstrating in defense of the most vulnerable among us, little babies butchered by a psychopath who, in addition to the bare fact of his infanticide, also flagrantly violates federal law. What Biden has done is as evil a political act as one can imagine. Which got me thinking, and which also got me into trouble on Twitter. I've noticed that thinking frequently gets people into trouble in politics. We hear a lot about our evil foreign adversaries, Vladimir Putin in Russia, Xi Jinping in China, both rulers who have done many evil things, no doubt. And yet, presented with the case of these 8 pro-life prisoners, a distressing thought entered my mind. Is it possible that our own president, Joe Biden, is as evil a ruler as Putin or Xi? Is it possible that our president, Joe Biden, is even more evil a ruler than Putin or Xi? It seems crazy, I know, and yet I just can't get the nagging thought out of my mind. Chairman Xi operates internment camps for Uyghurs, a Muslim minority in northwest China. Xi uses these Uyghurs for forced labor, a crime condemned around the world, but with condemnations that lose some of their credibility when we discover that the products that the Uyghurs have been forced to build are, among other things, our iPhones. So people will tweet their outrage at this abuse on the very products of the abuse. I can't help but notice that President Biden has not sought to shut down that supply chain with China. His predecessor did. His predecessor, President Trump, made it a key plank of his presidency to decouple from China. China, as he pronounced it. But Joe Biden and the rest of the liberal ruling class have spent decades sending even more of our manufacturing to China, which means complicity with that exploitative and flat-out forced labor. Xi and Putin jailed dissidents. That's true. Douglas Mackey is currently facing 11 years in prison, American prison, for tweeting out an anodyne right-wing meme. He was convicted by a federal court, a judge appointed by the Obama-Biden administration back in March. Xi and Putin arrest their country's respective opposition leaders. Joe Biden, he wouldn't ever do such a thing, would he? Like 4 times in the same year? Would he try to do such a thing? I think he might. Putin seeks to rule over neighboring countries, such as Ukraine. Joe Biden, to his credit, does not want to invade Ukraine. He just wants to pick their prosecutors to make sure that the payments keep coming in to the Biden family. He wants to make sure that none of those prosecutors meddle and stop the tribute payments. In Xi's China and Putin's Russia, the ruling parties control the press. Do I even need to say any more? In fairness, though, there are still a few domestic outlets that will publish damaging reports about the Bidens. But unfortunately, no one will get to see those reports while they matter because the FBI will go in and tell the big tech companies to censor those reports, even in private communications. The most serious crimes committed by Xi's regime on the Uyghurs are sterilization, contraception, and abortion. Taken together, the executive director of the Campaign for Uyghurs argues that these 3 crimes fit the UN's definition of genocide, and I agree. But then, I can't help but notice that President Biden encourages all those very same things indiscriminately on our own people, even on children. Modern liberal culture tells us that liberty is the right to choose. This is how most people today, even conservatives, think about liberty. But this is not the way that our forebears thought about liberty. This is not the way that our civilization has understood liberty from the pagan Greeks up through the Christian medievals and Renaissance people, all the way up through just a few hundred years ago. Up until that time, liberty was understood quite differently. Even Lord Acton, an ardent liberal, a favorite of libertarians, famously admitted that liberty is not the ability to do what we wish, but rather the right to do what we ought. The 19th century Spanish writer Donoso Cortés put it even more clearly. Cortés wrote, quote, "When man came from the hands of God, he understood the good. And because he understood, he willed it. And because he willed, he executed it. And by executing the good his will desired and his intellect understood, he was free." That this is the Christian signification of liberty is clear from the following words of the gospel: "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." We know that liberty cannot merely be the absence of external constraint when we consider the case of the heroin addict. According to the modern liberal conception, the freest man is the man with the fewest external constraints. So, according to that definition, the freest man in America must be the heroin addict in San Francisco, right? As long as he's got a few bucks in his pocket, however dubiously he acquired those bucks, as long as he's got a needle that he can put into his arm, well, then he can shoot up dope in a filthy alleyway and no cop is going to stop him. He can loiter, he can defecate in the streets, and he can sleep on the sidewalk until he freezes and dies of exposure. Man, isn't he free? I don't think so. He is a slave. He's a slave to his appetites, his passions, and his lower will. And he knows it, by the way. He probably wishes to break his addiction. He almost certainly does. But his appetites cloud his intellect, and his defective will succumbs to temptation until it destroys him. Anyone who's ever had a bad habit, or a good habit for that matter, knows that the more you do something, the easier it is to do that thing, and the harder it is to do the opposite. The more you do drugs, the easier it is to do drugs. The more you learn, the easier it is to know things. The fact of human nature reveals a second error with the liberal definition of liberty, namely, that the better that we become, or the worse that we become, the less free we should be. This is an unfamiliar thought today. What I mean is, so long as we have no habits, tastes, or inclinations, so long as we are perfectly neutral, then we are perfectly free, according to the liberals, because we are perfectly disposed to choose between alternatives. But the moment that we begin to develop habits and tastes and inclinations, which of course happens to us all the time, whether we want to or not, then suddenly we are less free to choose between alternatives. The moment we start shooting heroin, the less able we are to choose not to shoot heroin. The moment we start to learn, the less able we are to fall into error. Taken to its logical conclusion, we see the absurdity of the liberal definition of liberty in the case of God. Because according to the liberal definition, God himself is not free, because God cannot sin. His very being precludes him from evil. And yet, does anyone seriously believe that God, the maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible, is not free? Even an atheist must admit that the very concept of God demands that God be not only free, but perfectly free. And so he is. So how can this be? It's for the same reason that we all know intuitively that the heroin addict is not free, because freedom is not impartiality between good and evil, right and wrong, truth and falsehood. Freedom is not synonymous with choice. On the contrary, choice is a defect of our liberty, which actually consists of willing and understanding. Human beings, unique among the animals, possess intellect and will. That is what distinguishes us from the other animals. Other animals possess instinct. A chihuahua can sometimes figure out where we keep the dog food, and just ferret in there and go eat it out of the cabinet. But a chihuahua cannot write a poem or contemplate justice. The best they can do is sing in Taco Bell commercials, and that is not a very high level of consciousness or understanding. As a consequence, neither chihuahuas nor any other non-human animal is free. We put human beings on trial for committing crimes because human beings are expected to know better and act better. crimes are an abuse of our liberty. We do not put chihuahuas on trial, much as sometimes we might like to, even if the little chihuahua bites a little kid at the park. Because chihuahuas cannot abuse their liberty, because they don't have any liberty, because they don't have intellect or will. Liberty, therefore, is not the maximization of choice, but the perfection of our understanding and of our will. And since God alone understands and wills perfectly, God alone is perfectly free. And we will be free only inasmuch as we align our wills and our intellects with God. I know that all of this probably sounds strange in an age when Reddit-tier atheism reigns supreme in politics. But this is how the wisest men of history have understood the defining feature of human nature. Which brings me back to Joe Biden. I know that was a long digression through counter-revolutionary political theologians, but I think it was an important digression. And now we arrive back at Joe Biden, not one of the wisest men in history, as well as Putin and Xi. Chairman Xi peddles contraception, sterilization, and abortion on some of his people through coercion. Biden pushes the same thing on all of his people, but we are told he does so consensually. But, as we have just seen, this supposed consent is rather dubious, in part because children can't consent, in part because the state impels these procedures and even outright coerces them in certain cases, but also, more broadly, because President Biden wields the power of the state to darken people's intellect and to compromise their will. If liberty consists, as it does, in the perfection of the intellect and the will, then any campaign to undermine the intellect and the will is an assault on liberty. Xi and Putin, for all of their sins, don't deny the human reality of marriage. Xi and Putin, for all of their sins, don't force weird sex stuff on little kids in elementary schools. When the Biden administration encourages vice, the free flow of drugs across our southern border, the legalization of drugs within the United States, the destruction of the family, promiscuous sex, ubiquitous porn, abortion, and all of the other vices that Biden and our liberal elite exalt as positive goods, that constitutes an attack on our will and therefore an attack on our liberty. Now, lest it seem like I am letting foreign despots off the hook, on at least one issue, I think, we can give Biden credit over Xi or Putin. Unlike Putin, Joe Biden has never, to my knowledge, had any of his political opponents assassinated. He leaves that to the Clintons. I'm joking. Hillary, I'm joking, please, I have a family. Please, don't do this to me. That's one point for Biden. But if we're tallying up body counts, while Biden may only imprison political dissidents rather than assassinate them, he also publicly encourages the killing of babies in the womb up until the moment of birth. Virtually every Democrat in Congress, just down the road, joined him in that effort when they voted for the so-called Women's Health Protection Act, which mercifully failed, but which would have allowed for the killing of babies at all stages of pregnancy up until the very moment of birth. This is a far more expansive abortion policy than exists in either Xi's China or Putin's Russia. It accounts presently for over 800,000 corpses per year, and that number would go much higher if Biden and congressional Democrats got their way. Biden, unlike our foes overseas, actively undermines the institution of the family, the fundamental political unit, lawlessly opens our national borders, and cloaks his injustice behind the facade of democracy. When Xi and Putin do something rotten in pursuit of their national interest, they do it as the autocrats that they are. When Biden does something rotten, usually against our national interest, he does so with the additional scandal of his doing so under the dubious guise of our democracy. Which brings me to a crucial point. When I suggest that Joe Biden might be as evil or more evil a ruler than some of our foreign adversaries, I do not for one second suggest that America is a more evil country than Russia or China. I am reluctant to write off any country in those kinds of stark terms, but even if I were so inclined, I would continue to believe my own country to be largely good. To quote The Godfather, "I believe in America." It's the very first line. I would also quote it and say, "You can act like a man, what's the matter with you?" But that would be a topic for another speech. This raises a question, though. If America is largely good, and America's rulers are largely bad, and America's government is one of the people, by the people, for the people, then one of those statements can't be true.